This morning's lesson, we are going to be studying Samson. This is one that I promised to do for someone a while back, and I'm gonna make good on that promise and study Samson. And one of the things about Samson, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, he is among those who are mentioned as the Hebrew writer says, time is failing him to mention and expound upon all these different ones, and he gives us a list of individuals who are listed in this as great men of faith throughout the Old Testament. The Hebrew writers spent a lot of time on some of the great men like Abraham and Moses, and down here in verse 32 he says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon." We studied Gideon a while back. Barak. We studied Barak a while back as well. Of Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. So we think about Samson today, and Samson is one of those iconic figures. Now, some of the artwork is not exactly historically correct or biblically correct, so take it with a grain of salt, disclaimer up front. But it was the best pictures that we could find, and I felt like we needed some animation with Samson. But, realistically, if I were to ask the kids today, the kids could tell me all about Samson. As Samson is one of those figures that we talk about, we teach in our Bible studies, we teach our children about Samson and Delilah and Samson's strength, and they do a pretty good job about that. So where's that leave me? Can you imagine, try to put yourself in a preacher's position. How do you talk about something that is this iconic figure in the scriptures? How do you talk about someone and say something that you've never thought about? And I was thinking about that as I was preparing this lesson. What am I going to say that y'all haven't heard 100 times? And then I read the story of Samson. I was like, there's more to this than what I thought. We oftentimes focus in on certain aspects of a story and we leave the rest untold. And so this is, even on the Leave It to Beaver series. I loved watching Leave It to Beaver, and I still enjoy those. And Beaver comes home from Bible class one day, and his mother asked him what he studied in Bible class, and he said, "We studied about Samson." I can't remember exactly what Gene Carver said, something to the effect, "What did you learn?" And Beaver goes on about all this stuff, how they cut his hair and, gouged out his eyes, and, he's like, and they were mean to him too. And so Samson is one of these iconic figures out of the book of Judges. And we're going to spend most of our time this morning in the book of Judges. So if you want to go ahead and turn back there to the book of Judges, chapter 13, we'll begin with who Samson was. I think one of the most important things about Samson is to understand that Samson was not a normal, run-of-the-mill Israelite. Samson was given to an elderly, childless couple with only one condition. We find that condition in Judges chapter 13, verses 2 through 5. But I want to make note of Judges chapter 13, verse 1, so begin there with me. "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." If you read the book of Judges, this is a reoccurring theme. They fall from God's grace. They do what's evil. They sin against God, and God allows their enemies to overrun them. Friends, today my fear is that where we are in the world today, as a society, my fear is that we have turned our backs on God, just as Israel did. And we will suffer the consequences. I really think that we are seeing a repeat of history. But nevertheless, so the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years Israel is under oppression in the Philistines. Now, introduction to Samson in verse 2. There was a certain man of Zorah, the tribe of Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful, and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. We could go on a little bit farther. It's very fascinating. I encourage you to read that entire chapter. But for time's sake this morning, I wanted us to notice that Samson was a Nazarite from birth. The Nazarite is described by Moses in Numbers chapter 6 as the children of Israel are coming up out of the land of Egypt. There is a vow or a promise that an individual could make that describes what it is to be this Nazarite, as they were called. Numbers chapter 6 and in verse 1 of that chapter. And the Lord spake to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of the grapes, or eat grapes, fresh or dried, all the days of his separation. He shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. All the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall touch his head, until the time is completed for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. He shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow long. All the days of his separation, all the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, not even for his father or for his mother, for his brother or sister. If they shall die, he shall make himself unclean, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord. Now, from this passage, we see a few things about Samson, and this will help us get a better understanding of who he is and who God wanted him to be. A Nazarite vow could either be vowed by a man or a woman. That individual could consume no alcohol, not even grape skins. Alcohol, primarily during Bible times, was wine from grape juice. And so he was to separate himself from all of that impurity. Not even grape juice, not even grape seeds, not even the skins. Another aspect is that they were never to cut their hair. No body hair was to be cut. These were primarily outward signs of identifying themselves to those around them as one who had separated himself for the service of God. So in other words, you could identify a Nazirite very readily in Israel by the way they dressed, particularly if the Nazirite was a man. Long hair was something that was frowned upon by the Jewish religion, and so it identified them very readily as being a Nazirite. There were Nazirites by choice. The Apostle Paul, in Acts chapter 18, verse 18, as he's working with the church of Corinth. Ironically, last week we studied that in our lesson, but we've also been studying it in our Bible study in the older kids class and adult class out here in the auditorium. And so it is noted that the Apostle Paul shaved his head in Acts chapter 18, verse 18, for he had a vow. This was the ending of his Nazirite vow. And if you follow that out, something that I found very interesting that is not written by Moses in the scripture here, right in the passage I read, but later on you see that the Apostle Paul was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. In fact, at Ephesus, he said he had to present himself in the temple. That was following the ending of this vow, following the shaving of his head. Paul had 30 days in which to get to Jerusalem after he completed his vow to offer the offering prescribed by Moses, which of course Paul's a New Testament Christian. But Paul's following the Nazirite vow. Paul makes that Nazirite vow when he comes to Corinth, or actually not when he comes, but rather very shortly after he came to Corinth. He made that vow when we noted that Paul dedicated himself wholly to the preaching of the gospel. After Timothy and Titus came to him, Paul dedicated himself completely to the preaching of the gospel at Corinth. And he grew that hair and became a Nazirite under the vow for the preaching of the gospel. Now there were also Nazirites by birth. Samuel the prophet in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 11. Samuel was like Samson, a Nazirite by birth. These are the only two that I'm aware of. There may be others in the scripture, but these are the two Nazirites by birth that we notice most often in the scriptures. Now Samson grew. Now obviously the difference in Samson in childhood would have been the dietary restrictions of a Nazirite and the hair restrictions of a Nazirite. But if we look at Judges chapter 13, verse 25, the scripture very simply states that as a young adult, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him. There's something in Samson that he is wanting to do God's will, the stirring of needing to serve God. I'm sure that his parents told him the reason for his long hair. I'm sure that his parents must have told him that he was a Nazirite by request of God. During this time period when Samson is a young man, probably late teens, early 20s, he begins to look for ways to harm the Philistines for their oppression of Israel. Remember, this is what God says. If we look here at what God said that Samson would do, it said that he would, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. I want you to make notice of that. It does not say that Samson will save. Sometimes we get that a little confused in our Bible story accounts. That Samson saved Israel from the Philistines is kind of a misnomer here. But what Samson does is he begins a process. Now, here's highlights that we teach the kids. You know, in Judges chapter 15, Samson becomes angry with his father-in-law for giving his wife to another man. We'll get into that in a moment. But that's something you didn't know. But Here's something we do teach the kids. When he's angry with his father-in-law for giving his wife to his best man, he decides to get even. His father-in-law's Philistine. He decides to get even with all the Philistines for this problem that they've caused him. And so he catches 300 foxes. Look, let's read this account here in Judges 15, verse 3. It says, and Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regards to the Philistines when I do them harm. He's saying it's going to be justifiable harm. It's not going to be vindictive. He says it's going to be justifiable. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes. Now, I don't know how in the world to catch 300 foxes. They must have had a real problem. But he caught 300 foxes and took torches. And he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. Oh, would our animal lovers just dislike the story? Something terrible, Sally. I'm sorry. But you know what? All they're going to do is get singed tails because the ropes that hold it are not going to stay there. But he put them tail to tail. And he lit the torch on fire. See what it says here in verse 5? And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. Oh, my lands. Whew. Can't you imagine the problems? I mean, foxes, 300 of them. You know, that's 150 torches through standing grain. That was a horrible blow to the Philistines. Again, the kids could have told me that story. We know it well. The jawbone. This is what I remember as a child. You know, and so Samson slays all these people, 1,000 of them, with the jawbone of a donkey. Mind you, Samson had an extremely gifted in his strength. But if you turn over here to chapter 15, drop down to verse 14, one of the highlights here of Samson's life. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax, that he caught as flax that caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. This is God giving him supernatural strength to break the ropes that they have him bound with. It says, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. I don't know what the significance of being fresh is, other than it might have been a little smelly yet. He put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I've struck 1,000 men. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. Ramath Lehi. So there's a couple of the highlights of Samson's life. I just wanted to hit them because those are things we recognize. But the other side of Samson, the side that, wait a minute, is there a side that we don't talk about? I think there is. There's a side sometimes that we shy away from. And sometimes there's a side in Bible characters that we don't want to talk about. Sometimes it might be considered a darker side. This is Samson's human side. Sometimes we get the idea that Bible characters are perfect, and we try to push away these. We've been studying on Wednesday nights in the book of Genesis. I'll tell you what, there are some things in that book of Genesis that's just pretty, we have to be careful how we talk about them in front of children. There's some things in that book of Genesis that are pretty dark. And so, Samson has a side like this. First of all, we see Samson's marriage. If we back up into Judges chapter 14, the whole issue that led up to the foxtails had to do with Samson's marriage to a Philistine woman. Now, in the law of Moses, according to the law of Moses, if Samson was living by the law of Moses, as every good Nazirite who's living for God should have been, Samson should never have married a Philistine woman to begin with. But in Judges chapter 14, we see Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah, he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all the people that you must take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. So this is, I don't know how you want to look at this. The Bible does clearly say that it's from the Lord. So I'm not going to argue with the Bible that Samson had God in mind when he decided to marry a woman of the Philistines. Nevertheless, I think we see demonstrated Samson's human side in that when he's married to this woman, he begins to taunt her relatives. And this, again, it's an outlash at the Philistines. And if we drop down here to Judges chapter 14, verse 10, we're going to skip a section here where Samson kills a lion with his bare hands, and there's bees in the body of the lion, and there's honey in there, and it gives Samson this idea for a riddle. And in verse 10 it says, His father went down to the woman, Samson, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, These companions were Philistines. Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments. It's a big deal. To us, a garment doesn't mean anything, but this is a big deal. It changes and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, Put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them, Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? This is the kind of society they lived in. Who goes to a wedding feast and threatens to burn the bride in her father's house? We don't comprehend this. The Philistines were not nice people. Let me put it that way. And Samson's wife wept over him. Oh, every time our wives weep over us, it's just, I don't know what it is. It's just the waterworks get you every time. And listen to what she says to Samson. You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. Oh, can't you hear this? This poor thing sobbing. And he said to her, Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother. And shall I tell you? She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then he told the riddle. Then she told the riddle to her people. And the men of the city said to him, 7 days before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. I just love that, because that gives us the human side of Samson. It also gives us the insight into what kind of people the Philistines were. His wife gave him away. Not only his wife she gave him away basically during their wedding ceremony, their wedding feast, their honeymoon. What kind of people are these? It might be worth noting that Samson had a bit of a temper. Judges 14, down in verse 19, it says the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave their garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. Now, that hot anger. He goes down and kills these guys for answering the riddle. Goes back to his father's house with hot anger. That tells us Samson's human side. The Apostle Paul says, be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. In Judges chapter 16, we see another very sobering side of Samson. Now, this is after his wife has died at the hand of her own people because of the foxtails. Samson is involved in chapter 16, verse 1, with a prostitute. We're not going to go in detail because of the age of our mixed audience. But really, a Nazirite, someone who is separated for the work of God, involved in a prostitute. And then Samson's biggest mistake, the one we know the best, Delilah. Again, another Philistine. Oftentimes, our confidence, we talked about this very briefly in Bible class, oftentimes our confidence is our weakness. Samson was a Nazirite. He was set apart for the use of God. But did Samson act like it? I put that question to you this morning. Did Samson live like he was set apart for the use of God? In all honesty, yes, Silas, I would have to shake my head. No, Samson did not live like he was set apart for the use of God. He marries a woman of the Philistines. Samson has a temper. Samson causes a lot of mischief. Samson is involved with a prostitute. No, he did not live like he was set apart for the service of God. Again, Samson fell in love. And he fell in love this time. The first time, it does not say that he loved his first wife. It does not say. It says that God basically laid that on his heart in order to begin the process with the Philistines, between Samson and the Philistines. But here, in Judges chapter 16, verses 4 and 5, it says, after this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, seduce him, and see where his strength lies, by what means we may overpower him and may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Delilah didn't love Samson. We know the story. We don't have to wonder what happens. Several times Samson played with Delilah and did not tell her what the secret to his strength was. Samson knew that the secret to his strength was his long hair, symbolizing his Nazirite vow. Break the vow, lose the supernatural strength that God gave him. That's Samson. This indicates he did not trust Delilah. He learned something from his first wife. But now, and again, we have no indication that Samson and Delilah were married, living together in sexual immorality. It would seem to be the case. And drop down with me, Judges chapter 16, verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you may be bound that one could subdue you. Wouldn't you have to wonder why in the world someone is asking you this question? I don't know about Sally and Cynthia and you ladies, but I would think you'd like your real strong man. But this would kind of spark my my questioning. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. In other words, they just popped right off. So the secret of his strength was not known. Now, if the first questionnaire wasn't a red flag, wouldn't this be a red flag? Samson's got brute strength, but he doesn't have brains. There's something lacking up there. So then Delilah, they say love is blind. Maybe that's what it is. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like threads. Then Samson said to Delilah, Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound. Then he said to her, if you were to weave 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web. Now that web mentioned here is a loom. And she made them tight with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, how can you say that you love me? Can't you hear this? Just imagine this in the scene of a play. How can you say that you love me? when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times. You have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. Oh my. You know, this is just one of those very dramatic passages of the scripture. And you can see the emotional roller coaster that Samson's in. He's in love with a woman. If he's got an ounce of brain capacity, he knows he can't trust her. I mean, look at what she's done to him so far. Every time he's told her a falsehood, 3 times. 3 times she's tried to take his strength away. This is ludicrous. Samson really needs to see a psychiatrist because he's not right in the head. Verse 17, and he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head. For I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Oh, my. The tears must have worked. The water works. So Samson. My question to you is, why is Samson in the Hall of Fame? Why did the Hebrew writers see fit to mention him? These other characters in the book of Judges that the Hebrew writer mentions, I understand. Gideon, I perfectly wrap my mind around Gideon. A greater man of faith, I don't think ever existed than Gideon. But Samson? This guy does not demonstrate faith. He does not demonstrate obedience to God. I don't get this. At least not at this point. I think if we look at the conclusion, Samson, as soon as Delilah cuts his hair, his strength is gone. The Philistines capture him. They torture him. They gouge his eyes out. They bring him to their capital city. They bind him between 2 columns, supporting the roof of the house. Their intention is to, I quote, make sport of him. You can only imagine what that might entail. They're having fun at his expense. He has tormented them for years, caused thousands of deaths. Somewhere in the neighborhood, 2,000-3,000 people have died because of Samson. They're anxious to even the score. And they don't just want to kill Samson, they want to torment him. Let me remind us, bringing this into our level, an application we can make today. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, the Apostle Paul says, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I don't know about you, but I fall into that category. Samson fell into that category. Samson sinned and he fell short of the glory of God. If we learn nothing else, and the reason that I believe the Hebrew writer included Samson in his chapter of faith, is that Samson demonstrates that even when we fail, even when we fall short of the glory of God, even when we sin, we still have hope of victory. I believe that's the reason the Hebrew writer mentions Samson. And that is the reason that we teach Samson to our children. Is that even for all of his faults and failings, at the end of his life, Samson demonstrates courage, conviction, and faith. Judges chapter 16 ends Samson's life at about, we'll begin in verse 18 where we left off. When Delilah had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up again, for he has told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands, she made him sleep on her knees. She called a man, and had him shave off the locks of his head. Then she began to torment him. And Samson loved this woman, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and rejoiced and said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the revenger of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson, that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. I love the Bible, the vagueness here. Samson called to the Lord and said, so Samson's in the middle of a prayer. I don't believe that he's calling out loud. Maybe he is. But this is what he says in prayer to God. "Oh Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once. O God, that I may avenge the Philistines for mine 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtola, the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. It's rather a sobering ending to a story. But yet it's an ending to a story. Even though Samson dies, Samson brought more glory to God in his death and more victory over his enemies in his death and in his life. We'll end Samson there, but as I said before, I think the reason that Samson is in the chapter of faith is his death. Reminding us that we can mess up in life, we can make mistakes, and God still loves us. And God still has the ability, even at the ending of life, to set things right, if we're willing to set things right in our lives. Take out your songbooks, number 68, because